All right, well, we left off with Gary just returning from Red River Mission in 1830, and I'm going to give his story in little bite sizes here, little chapters along the way, and the first of these is what I'm calling Gary the Missionary. This is the first 5 years or so from the time he arrived back here in the Pacific Northwest until about 1836. There was a lawyer who was acquainted with Gary really toward the end of his life, who later wrote the first biography of him. The man's name was Richard Lewis. As a lawyer, he wrote a defense of Gary, who at least for a time had been viewed somewhat disparagingly in the white culture of this Spokane area by then, and he wanted to rehabilitate the memory of Spokane Garry, and so he wrote a biography. I'll refer to more to it a little bit later, but he gives us this interesting description of Gary during these years. He says, throughout his life, Gary dressed in the costume of the whites, although preferring a blanket to an overcoat for wear in cold weather. His family also dressed in the costume of the whites, and in the early days lived in considerable comfort, keeping on hand supplies of tea, coffee, sugar, and flour, commodities which some few of the white settlers in the vicinity did not always possess. This was really a time, as I was saying last week, when Gary knew how to abound. He sometimes was abased, he sometimes abounded. This was a time when he was highly regarded. The white presence here was really almost non-existent, except for the Spokane House trading post there and a few white trappers and so on, but really the missionary influence had not shown up much yet. And he was really held in very high esteem. And he enjoyed a certain degree of comfort and prestige during those years. He led worship services every Sunday here in the Spokane area. It was really near the Spokane House where he grew up. He attracted native attenders to these services that he would hold from the Colville tribe, Nez Perce, Coeur d'Alene, Pend d'Oreille, Flathead, Okanagan, and others. They would travel to participate in worship, so that sometimes very large gatherings would be here as Gary would lead in worship. He also started a school at that time which trained in English, in agricultural techniques, in basics of Christianity, all of which, of course, he had learned at the Red River. Many of you are familiar with, on the Maple Street corridor there, you have this sign, Drumheller Spring Indian Historical Site. Not far from it is this monument, which was put up by the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1964. It reads, quote, "Near this site, Chief Spokane Garry held school in 1830. The schoolhouse was 50 by 20, was constructed of pine poles covered with tool mats, sewed together by Indian women. Spokane Garry was born about 1813, it was actually 1811. By 1825, he was taken by Sir George Simpson of the Hudson's Bay Company to the Red River Missionary School near Winnipeg, Canada, where he was educated. Chief Spokane Garry was teacher and missionary to his people for 60 years. There is one error in this monument. The Daughters of the American Revolution couldn't have known it at the time, but this school that was there at that location was actually built by Gary some years later, more in the 1860s and 70s. The school he started in the early 1830s was actually right in the immediate vicinity of the Spokane House. So he had two different schools in his career, and the other one was, this was actually a later site that was discovered in subsequent research about his life. He had a marked Christian influence throughout the region. I mentioned to you some weeks back Samuel Parker. Samuel Parker made an initial excursion into this region, bringing with him Marcus Whitman. Marcus Whitman and Samuel Parker came out here for just a few months and then went home. Marcus Whitman then recruited Spaldings and others to come out with him and establish the mission. So this was a very brief visit in which Samuel Parker was the lead missionary, and he traveled around. Both of them were stunned at the kind of common Christian practice that was so conspicuous among the tribes of the Northwest. Samuel Parker describes his experience in leading worship among the Nez Perce in the following words, quote, "They all continued in a kneeling position during the singing and prayer, and when I closed the prayer with amen, they all said what was equivalent in their language to amen. And then I commenced the sermon. When I commenced the sermon, they seated themselves back upon their heels. They gave the utmost attention, and entire silence prevailed, excepting when some truth arrested their mind forcibly. A little humming sound was made through the whole assembly, occupying 2 or 3 seconds. So this was the style of worship, and they had certainly gained this kind of protocol for worship in their experience with Garry. Things began to turn slightly beginning about 1837 and for the next decade. You'll recall that it was 1836 when Whitman and Spalding and others came and established their missions at Walapu for the Whitmans and Lapwai for the Spaldings. This was 1836. Shortly after establishing themselves there, Spalding and William Gray, who was their kind of handyman missionary, made a trip to Colville. Colville at that time had become the major Hudson Bay Company post. The Spokane house by then had closed. And so they made a trip and they went right through this area. And this was the first time that Spalding met Chief Garry. And so while here, Garry, knowing that Spalding was a missionary, asked if he would speak at the Sunday gathering that he was going to have with the natives here. William Gray described the observations that he made at that time in the following words. He says, "Their manners are mild and hospitable, manifesting a strong religious feeling, devout in all their form of worship and strict in attending all their meetings of a religious character. They have a native school taught by one of their own young men who has received a limited education at Red River by the name of Garry. They also have a house devoted to religious meetings sufficiently large to contain all the persons of the village. Their worship is similar to that of the Nez Perce. Garry has a Bible from which he attempts to teach the natives." Now I just want you to catch the subtlety of the description. A little bit dismissive. A young fellow. Well, he was young. He received a limited education. Well, it's all true. Chief Garry would have been the first guy to admit it. He knew he was operating, in a sense, with limited capital in terms of the education he'd received, and he was doing as much as he could to exploit those resources that he had. I think one of the tragedies of this story is that he was not more fully appreciated by folks who came with a whole lot more capital, you might say, in terms of their educational resources and so on. So this little bit of a kind of condescending attitude only got worse. And it got worse especially with the arrival in this area of 2 missionaries who came in 1838, just 2 years later. They were part of a kind of second wave of missionaries. These are Cushing Eales and Elkanah Walker. These guys are Presbyterians. Now, I just want to put it on the table. I'm a Presbyterian. I love all things Presbyterian. So when I speak somewhat critically of these guys, please put it in a context of love and affection. I think they just blew it. You know, Presbyterians can blow it. And I think in this case, even though it's not an ugly story, it's much less of a wonderfully positive story than it could have been. These guys show up. These are seminary. These are like PhDs in theology. So from their point of view, Garry is pretty simple, even simplistic, you see, in his grasp of Christian teaching. And that's the kind of thing, unfortunately, that can happen. This is a description written by Cushing Eales to the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions in 1838, only a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months after he had arrived, and had become aware of Garry and his Christian ministry, and he writes these words back to his mission. He says, quote, "It has been the rather general impression among the best informed Indians that thieves, gamblers, Sabbath breakers, and such like will go to a place of misery when they die. But such as are not guilty of open vices and attend to a form of worship will go above. We have labored much to correct this and kindred errors." Now, you know, you got to see this from both sides. Garry is providing to these people a very fundamental, indeed we might say rudimentary, Christian teaching, including a Christian ethic. And he knew about Jesus. He knew about the gospel. That was right at the core of his message. But from the point of view of these guys, who are much more sophisticated in their theological acumen. It just wasn't making the cut. And so they feel like Gary's giving them too simple a message and they want to fix it, you know. Why couldn't they have reached out? Gary would have been happy to do this. I think we know enough about him to know he was a humble man. He was modestly aware of his limitations. Why couldn't they have reached out and built on the foundation rather than immediately starting to dismiss the achievements for which he was responsible? It's a sad thing. Unfortunately, it's characteristic of a lot of Christian history. Things only went from bad to worse with the arrival of a couple of Catholic priests, you see, over in Coeur d'Alene, who immediately began to, of course, win converts to the Catholic perspective, and largely the Coeur d'Alene tribes became Catholic for the most part from this point on. That was at the same time, 1838. The long and short of it was over the next 2 or 3 years, the tribes in this region began to fragment into a variety of sort of subsets and various disputes. You know how it goes. And the problem is, many of these folks came back and asked Gary for clarification. Well, Gary, what do you think about transubstantiation? You know, what's your view of purgatory? You know, what about you? What do you think? What's your view of predestination? You know, and Gary is not equipped to respond to these kinds of theological interrogatories. You know, he just isn't. And finally, in a kind of frustration, he actually closed the school in the early 1840s. There's a famous quote from, many people read it out of context and don't quite appreciate the point, but he says something like this: they were just jawing me too much. You know, it was just too much of these picayune questions of theology. He didn't know even how to handle them, nor did he have much interest in doing so. He just wanted to lead worship of the Christ he loved. And so, as a result of that, the school began to close, but Gary continued to be involved in ministry of various sorts. There's a very interesting quote from Mary Walker. Mary Walker is the wife of Elkanah Walker, who was one of those Presbyterian missionaries. She describes Gary, who was involved in a service being run by Cushing Eales, in which he was preaching, and Gary was translating to the native group that had gathered there. And she makes this interesting observation. This is Mary Walker, quote, "Gary interpreted but seems embarrassed. He does pretty well at teaching and learning. I hope we shall be able to obtain much help from him, but I fear we shall not have wisdom to manage him as we ought. Mr. Walker and Mr. Eales will not have patience enough to get along." This is a note in her journal. Sometimes it's the women among us that really get it. You know, the guys are hard-headed, they're bullheaded, and she, I think, saw the missed opportunity, and at least alludes to it, I think, rather interestingly here. Gary, as he withdrew from more educational operations, just became involved in farming, and he had a very robust and successful farm agricultural enterprise for many years. He gained a fair amount of wealth in those years. He still maintained Sunday worship. He was still involved in that. But his attempts at education he sort of set aside because he felt literally, I think frankly, outclassed by these others who obviously had much more background than he did. When the Whitman Massacre took place in 1847, it threw everything into a bit of consternation, as you can imagine. It hit like a shock wave, this entire region. We, of course, mostly white folks here, look back and we've heard about the Whitman Massacre from a very white perspective. And I gave the story of that earlier, and I hope I was fair to what actually happened. But we have to appreciate there was a native perspective on this that was quite different, really, from what probably most of us take for granted. Whitman had come out here as a missionary and was warmly received at the beginning, but as increasingly white settlers moved in and more white settlers were dominating the landscape in Walla Walla and elsewhere, Whitman turned his attention, and Narcissa especially turned their attention, to providing care more for the white settlers than for the native population that was their original congregation. And I think the natives, the Cayuse especially, that's where they were feeling a little bit, pushed off to the edges. They were willing to deal with